Evacuation. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, all of Japanese ancestry, removed from their homes in the Pacific Coast states to wartime communities established in out-of-the-way places. Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great.
Internment camps. These camps had been set up by government authorities during times of war, specifically in World War II after the Japanese Imperial Army bombed Pearl Harbor and caused the United States of America to join the war. However, this gave both the Canadian and American governments a reason to partake in xenophobia and imprison approximately over 140,000 Japanese Canadians and Americans, accusing them of spying for their home country. During this time, both governments seized the rightful land and property of these citizens and never returned it. The question is, did the Japanese Canadians and Americans really spy for their country of origin? Or was this just another excuse for citizens of power to carry out another act of xenophobia?
How camps originated from systems of power. To understand how they relate, we need to look at where and how these policies and laws began. Focusing on British Columbia, the home of several East Asian immigrants, there were several laws placed that blatantly shows the xenophobia that the government, both provincial and federal, had up their sleeves. Ever since the start of the 20th century and immigration of East Asians to Canada, xenophobic laws have slowly been put in power, and people have experienced racism from the very start. White people discriminated and protested against the immigration of East Asians, and with that brought the Dominions Election Act in 1920. With this act, Asians were unable to vote on racial grounds. By the time World War II rolled around, the white population was already reeling for a reason to alienate the Japanese immigrants, and the war brought them one. Liberal Premier John Hart and Conservative Attorney General R.L. Maitland publicly called for the federal government to, quote, remove the menace of the fifth column from BC, unquote. They, along with other politicians, campaigned for the removal of Japanese Canadians.
The reason the federal government gave for the internment of the Japanese was that these people were considered dangerous and threatened the safety of Canada due to the war against Japan, and therefore they were seen as enemy aliens. However, even at the time, the chiefs of Navy and the Canadian Army were strongly against interning Japanese Canadians, as they didn't think they posed any risks, and 77% of the Japanese who were interned were also British subjects with very minimal ties to Japan. The entirety of the campaign was founded upon racism, and the internment camps were born as a result.
How have internees been affected in the long run? What you don't hear about in a lot of media is how have the internees moved on from being interned. During the process of removing a family, government officials would confiscate their homes, belongings, and businesses, oftentimes selling their possessions to break even the cost of internment camps. To formally apologize for their actions, on September 22, 1988, the Canadian federal government had signed the Japanese-Canadian Readdress Agreement and promised a compensation package for all interned Japanese Canadians. Each survivor was compensated a total of $21,000, which is $42,452 in today's dollars. Not only was it not enough to buy back their land and property, but they were compensated 39 years after their release. So, what was life like after internment? We visited the Nikkei National Cultural Museum here in Burnaby and looked at several primary sources about pre-internment, during internment, and post-internment lives of the Japanese Canadians. For most Japanese Canadians, life after internment was really hard. After internment, Japanese Canadians had virtually no property left. In fact, While they were interned, the RCMP sold many of their fishing boats, forcing them to build their lives and homes back up again while dealing with all the xenophobia, racism, and stigma the internment camps had placed upon them. The camp Layla and her family were forced to move to was much more similar to the internment camps that the Japanese Canadians were placed in, since the government's goal was not to kill, unlike the Nazi concentration camps. You can imagine that Layla and her family's lives would be similar to those of the Japanese Canadians after leaving the camps.
So, what is the relationship between systems of power and xenophobia? Primarily the people who have the power, who build the system. Everyone has a bias, and their bias influences decisions. As we see a trend in xenophobic people in power, their system and laws affect those who aren't like them. Thus why so many xenophobic laws were passed, and why internment camps were set up for the Japanese Canadians and Americans. However, we see the effect of internment camps today. Another part of our history left out of the curriculum, the hurt and theft that occurred post-internment. Not only did people suffer the costs of losing their homes, but the trauma faced in these camps came with them. We learn about the country's mistakes and study the history so we may never make these mistakes again. This way, we learn the outcomes of internment of people, the relationship people in power and systems of power have with hate, and just how some bias can hurt so many and cause huge historical events, such as this one.